So from our group are here today Ariadna, who is from Europeana. There's also Maarten Zijnstra from our group, who is based in Holland. He a copyright specialist also. And there is Brigitte Vezina, who is also part of Creative Commons. And both Maarten and Brigitte have worked on the Europeana on an update on how we should consider whether we should consider an update of the Europeana Public Domain Charter. If things went right, you had a draft of this document of the text to review before the meeting. And so we will discuss the document after the presentation of the whys, the what's, the purpose and the focus is of this proposed review of this public domain charter. As a side note, this is also part of the work we are doing in a more focused task group, which is a task group on Article 14. And that's Article 14 of the DSM, which is focused on the protection of the public domain. So the idea is that works that are in the public domain should be in the public domain. There's a lot of discussion going on the public domain since then. And this is also one of the reasons why we thought we could take another look actually at this. It was the right time to take another look at this public domain charter. So both Maarten and Brigitte are also a member of this task force, Article 14. So I will leave the word to them. So again, the slide part is recorded, and the second part, the open discussion, is not. So it's really meant to be an informal discussion. There are no stupid questions. So we would really, this is the reason why we do these office hours. We really appreciate the interaction. It's helpful, hopefully, for all parties in this process. So I'll hand it to you, Maarten and Brigitte.
Thank you for the introduction, Ellen. So we prepared some slides on what we found on the current challenges of the public domain charter and the new challenge of the public domain charter. So we'll present that today, and afterwards we'll have a discussion on these aspects. Feel free to use the chat to pose your questions during the presentation. Be aware that the presentation is being recorded. So if you interrupt, then your voice is being recorded. But I invite you to do so. That's already known. If you go to this domain name here, you'll immediately get to the review document that was also shared by you via email. So if you have not found that link, and it's also in the chat already, so there are multiple ways of getting there. Hopefully I'll see your comments in that document. So yeah, and Ellen already discussed most of this. This is part of the steering group on copyright of Europeana, and these are their members. This review has mostly been done, has been led by Brigitte and me. So the public domain charter is a document from 2010 from Europeana. It's a policy statement which is meant for the European GLAM sector to point at the problems or the challenges that the public domain faces when digitization occurs. And 2010 seems like only yesterday for some of us, but it's already been 14 years ago, and the world has changed substantively since then, which also means that we might need to update this charter, this policy document that guides Europeana and us as the heritage sector of Europe with their thinking about the public domain and the works that we have in our collections. So that's why at the end of last year, we thought about doing a review of that charter this year. So, and it's a slow process, so we can get a lot of feedback and get everyone on board. And so this is just one of the steps in this process. So as I said, the policy goals of the current charter, some of them have been met, others are outdated, and also the language that is used is outdated of the current public domain charter. And at the same time, we have new challenges because of the advance of technology, the changes in society, and how we relate to our collections, and also the rate of digitization in our collections. So if we look at the current charter, just to give a brief overview and introduction of the principles of the public domain, of a healthy public domain in the charter. These are very strong, these are very simple, high over principles, and we believe that these are still very valid. Well, copyright protection is temporary, as we all know. What is in the public domain needs to remain in the public domain, which we have seen has already had some legal intervention from Article 14 of the DSM directive. And the public domain use should be free to reuse, copy, and modify. And these are also still current challenges. And the challenges that we've also seen for some of the people who have also followed Communia. Earlier this week, there was also a Communia salon on this topic. So, and if we look at the last 14 years, if we look at the challenges that were addressed, are they, did society change, or did the law change? In some regard, it did. For example, in the Open Data Directive in 2014, there was a regulation on the term of public-private partnerships, for example, which was a challenge in the original public domain charter. Also, we have new tools in then for marking the public domain. Most interesting or most used is, of course, the Creative Commons public domain mark and CC0, but also the right statements public domain marks are also one of the answers to the challenges of the original public domain charter. And then, as already been referred to by Ellen, but also by me, Article 14 of the Copyright and Related Rights in the Digital Single Market Directive addresses some of the issues where digitization of a public domain work claimed new copyright, and that article states that is not the case. And then, of course, we also see greater adoption of open policies in GLAMs. So on removing costs for reproductions of the public domain, materials, not restricting the public domain, not claiming copyright on public domain materials. We see steps towards the right direction in this regard in the last 14 years. And so it's 14 years, so it's a long time. So even though some steps we think, oh, these were tiny, in 14 years, these were big steps. But that means there are also still current challenges to the public domain and new challenges. So some reoccur, which haven't been solved yet. And some are new because of societal changes. And we split these current challenges into 3 parts: in technical challenges, legal challenges, and societal challenges. And we'll quickly introduce them before we can have a broad discussion on these topics. So to first go into technological challenges, so these are current technological challenges. I think first and foremost, we see text and data mining as a challenge to the public domain, and our relation as the heritage sector to them. Text and data mining, as most of you know, feed a lot of the artificial intelligence movement and training material for that. And the question here is, should we allow, or do we need to allow, or should we not allow the use of public domain materials for text and data mining, and can we even disallow that? Then, similar to discussions 14 years ago about digitization of 2D objects, we now see similar discussions on digitization of 3D objects. And the question here is, do the digitization, the 3D digitization of objects, do they acquire new copyright? And there has been a report on this in the makings. I don't know if it has been published yet. It has been published, Ariadne?
Not yet, but in the coming months, I think so.
In the coming months, there will be a research paper on this, if I can call it, a report on this for Europeana. And then we also noted future impoverishments of the public domain. And what we mean by this is that because we see that more cultural expressions are created, are born digital and remain digital in their entire lifespan, how do you call this? Adding these types of objects to heritage collections can be challenging. Not all heritage institutions have mandates for this, which can lead to a future impoverishment because if these materials are not coming to our collections, then they might not exist at all in the future because they get lost. And then finally, a technological but and also a past but also current challenge is still marking the public domain. Here we see that we need a lot of the metadata pertaining to the creator of material in order to determine the public domain status of a work. And so we need additional tools and additional metadata for better marking of public domain materials to make these better available. So these are the technological challenges. We also have legal and societal challenges, and I'll give the floor to Brigitte to introduce those challenges. Brigitte.
Thanks, Martin. So I'll cover, like Martin said, some of the legal challenges that have emerged since the adoption of the Charter 14 years ago. And then the next slide will cover societal or other types of challenges. So in terms of legal challenges, the first one is maybe the most egregious one at the moment is some kind of encroachment, or at least a tension between access to cultural heritage in the public domain and laws that are designed to protect cultural heritage. So what we see is that in certain countries, including Italy, Spain, France, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Portugal, there are cultural heritage laws that restrict access to public domain heritage in the sense that they empower cultural institutions, public institutions, to restrict access to and to demand or to require that users ask for permission or they pay a fee in order to use the public domain cultural heritage. So in practice, what that means is that cultural heritage institutions in Italy, for example, will require any kind of user who wants to use an item, a digital image from their collections to have their intended use approved by the institution and also pay a fee, which can be sometimes substantial. And we see this as a contradiction of the principle of access to cultural heritage as it is enacted in Article 14, but also in all sorts of instruments supporting fundamental rights. It's a limitation of people's right to access culture and participate in cultural life. Our legal interpretation of it is that even though they don't claim copyright and try to license out those images, in the end, it has exactly the same effect as trying to, claim copyright on the digital image and requiring people to enter into a licensing agreement and paying a fee in order to be able to use the work. So we've seen examples in Italy of Leonardo da Vinci drawings being used on puzzles, and the museum suing the puzzle company for using that public domain image. And by the same token, another museum in Italy sued Jean-Paul Gaultier, the French designer, because they had used a reproduction of a Botticelli painting from the 1400s. And the list goes on. Michelangelo's David's sculpture was also kind of used. The image was used on the cover of a magazine, and institutions every time go after these reusers. So we want to look at this intersection and see how the public domain charter could strike the right balance and make sure that there's no encroachment on the public domain by these laws that really effectively act as a pseudo copyright. The second legal challenge is perpetual rights of integrity. So for those of you who are not familiar with copyright, but I think most of us are in this call, copyright consists of both economic and moral rights. And under the moral rights umbrella, there are two main rights, which is the right of attribution or paternity, which confers to authors the right to be named and cited in relation to the use of their works, but also the right of integrity, which prevents any kind of adaptation or modification that would cause a prejudice to the honor or reputation of the creator. And what happens is that in certain jurisdictions, the economic rights will expire 70 years after the death of the author, but the moral rights are perpetual. So they never expire, so they can go on and on and on long after the author's death. And this really creates some form of uncertainty for reusers, because sometimes adapting or modifying a work or reusing it, remixing it in a different context could potentially trigger this right of integrity. The heirs of the author could claim that by doing certain types of modification, the honor or the reputation has been prejudiced. And so there's this kind of dark cloud or the specter of perpetual rights of integrity that kind of hover over potential reusers. And so we'd like to see the charter addressing this issue. The third one on the list is previously unpublished works. The situation here is that in some jurisdictions, when works have been unpublished but are suddenly made available online, it kind of sets off a new copyright term of protection. So copyright will start from the moment of publication, which means that you can end up with very absurd situations where medieval manuscripts that were previously unpublished suddenly become published online, and that sets off a new term of protection, which is obviously not the purpose of copyright. So there must be a policy to address this incongruous situation. The fourth legal challenge is contractual overrides of the public domain. What happens in practice is that cultural heritage institutions will not necessarily claim copyright over digital reproductions of public domain works because they are not legally allowed to do so since the implementation of Article 14, but they will work around it and still require payment of a fee or even entering into a license or restricting access in any kind of way through contracts. Or most commonly through the terms of use on their website. So what they will do is they say, well, we have a property right over this digital image, therefore we grant access and use based on these licensing terms, which are founded in our property right of the digital image. Or they will simply say in their terms of use, by navigating and using the content of our website, you agree not to use this for commercial purposes, for example, which is some kind of contractual restriction, which goes against the principle that any use is allowed for works in the public domain. So it exists much like the copyright claims that were partially resolved by Article 14. It's a similar kind of barrier. And the fifth kind of legal challenge is the interplay between this public domain status, but also restrictions that are kind of justified through privacy and data protection. And here I think the key is to find the right balancing of potentially conflicting interests when public domain would allow unrestricted access, but GDPR or other kinds of data protection legislation might impose some restrictions on what content can be made openly accessible. So that's it for the legal challenges. I'll move now to the next type of challenges. On the next slide, right? So these can be considered like societal challenges, but I think going beyond how society has evolved. The first one, I think, maybe a little bit cryptic, enclosures by private commercial actors. It's really meant to address the issue that in Web 2.0, there has been a lot of privatization of what was initially the open web. So in the early days of the internet, there was a grand ambition for global interoperability and standardization, but little by little, we have seen the formation of proprietary platforms where sometimes cultural heritage in the public domain gets trapped and cannot be accessed outside of these walled gardens. So Europeana, I think, is one of the greatest ambassadors for this interoperability and standardization. But we are facing these like closed networks that really control large portions of the public domain. So the public domain charter should try to address how to remove those enclosures and make sure that there can be free circulation of the public domain on the web. The second type of challenge in this category has to do with ethical considerations or cultural sensitivities. There's, again, some kind of tension between the different layers of governing rules and structures around cultural heritage. So if we look at the structure of copyright, it determines, access and use when things are still under protection, but when things are in the public domain, suddenly there are absolutely no restrictions to what can be used with the cultural heritage. But in parallel, there might be other systems that govern access and use of cultural heritage, which might be under copyright law considered in the public domain. And that creates a tension because there might be traditional or customary rules or protocols or practices, or sometimes even laws that enshrine the rights of indigenous peoples or local communities, where there are some kind of justified limitations to accessing works in the public domain. And egregious cases would be, for example, making available human remains or sacred objects, objects with a special spiritual significance, or funerary objects, things that really are not meant to be widely diffused, even though under Western and IP regime, these would be considered free to use by anyone. So it's a question of finding how the two can coexist. And also, I think under this topic, we can start thinking about how to protect vulnerable groups. So not all content is maybe it's not desirable to make any kind of content open access, especially when it could expose vulnerable groups to harm. And here we can think about children or youth or marginalized people in general. The third point under this category is to be mindful of cultural heritage that is located in zones of armed conflicts during periods of conflict. So things of wars or other kind of situation where cultural heritage is actually a target and is intentionally destroyed as part of war efforts. So not only is it important to safeguard the public domain in the sites and the monuments and all the collections of the institutions that are located in these areas, it's really important to make sure that we can share those histories and that memory. It's all the more so important as the war efforts are sometimes trying to erase as a strategy to really kill the morale of the population. But there's also a risk of increasing their vulnerability as a target, because by making them more openly accessible, we might reveal information about their location and other details that make them actually easier to be the subject of systematic destruction. So this is something that we've been thinking about that could be addressed in the charter. And then the last point is around climate change. And here, I think there are three main points to consider when we think about climate change and access to cultural heritage in the public domain. First of all, access to public domain heritage is fundamental, is essential if we want people to be able to research and to understand the impact of climate change on our planet. There's lots of resources that are held in the collections of cultural heritage institutions that are in the public domain that are actually valuable resources for researchers, for scientists, but also for everyday citizens that want to understand the evolution of climate and how it might, continue, or how we might be able to mitigate it. And the second point is actually the threat of climate change for the collections in the public domain. So a lot of them are located in places that are really under threat of floods or drought or any kind of climate change induced weather disruptions. And so it's important to think about how to preserve that cultural heritage, and maybe public domain access is one way to make sure that it can survive. And then the last and the third aspect of the relationship between public domain and climate change is actually the carbon footprint of the activities of cultural heritage institutions through their digitalization process. So digitizing the collections, maintaining them in digital form, making them available online on a constant basis, that all has a carbon footprint. So how can we make sure that we mitigate that impact while still maintaining as fully open access as possible to public domain materials? So this concludes my part of an overview of the challenges that we think that public domain charter could take into account in its review. Back to you, Martin.
So, and this is also what you can see in the review document that has been shared in the chat as well. So we also invite you to have a look at the textual version of what we just discussed, and to provide feedback on that, but also to say, well, you missed this, or have you thought about this perspective, etc. So in looking forward, today we will be discussing what we have just described now, the current challenges that we have. So we'll have an open discussion later on, and then also the recording will stop, so everyone is free to voice their opinions on this. After that, we'll finalize the challenges overview, and then we also will produce a blog post on Europeana about this. Then we'll have a look if these challenges that we've identified are actually could actually be part of a new updated public domain charter for Europeana, because some of them might not be the best match to be addressed in such a policy document, might need to be addressed somewhere else in another form. So we'll draft proposed language, and we'll see if we can have a feedback loop on that as well. And then we already introduced the principles of the charter, and we also have to see if these principles of the charter are also still current or need to be revised. The whole will be reviewed as well, of course, and then finally we will seek approval for the revised charter if that is the way we choose to go. And so that will take the remainder of the year. But now we're at the point where we invite your interaction, I believe, to start a discussion on any of the topics. We are looking for things that we have missed, or maybe your perspectives, maybe an example of how you encounter one of these challenges that we've addressed, all of these kind of things. So the floor is to you. And Ariadne, could you stop the recording?